Sage Accpac allows you to transfer values between accounting functions within the same module, such as from a ship-to address in accounts receivable to the invoice header section of an accounts receivable invoice. However, values can be transferred between modules as well, such as an item master optional field to an order entry detail line optional field. You can even transfer optional field values bidirectionally between modules. For example, you can send the optional field from the order entry detail line to an accounts receivable detail line, or you can send optional fields back to the general ledger for unique reporting.
Let's continue with the earlier example of identifying hazardous items within inventory control by entering a sales order for the item. Let's create a new sales order for customer 1200 and enter the fluorescent desk lamp as an item he is wanting to purchase. When observing the available optional field information, the hazardous optional field is not available. This is because Accpac has not been instructed to pass the optional field value to another accounting function or within another module. The optional fields shown within the Details section of Order Entry have to be added there just like adding the optional fields for an item within Inventory Control. Let's cancel this order and instruct Accpac to use the hazardous optional field for sales order details. To do this, perform the same steps as adding the optional field to the item. This time, select the Optional Fields icon within the Setup icon of Order Entry. Because items are placed within the Details section of an order, an optional field value entered for an item can pass through to Order Entry. As discussed earlier, optional fields can be linked to either header or detail sections. For the purpose of this example, let's say you want to take your item header optional field and pass it through to an order entry detail optional field, because this is where items are referenced within order entry. Possibly you want to know at the order level which hazardous items customers are purchasing. To do this, select the Order Details function and add the hazardous optional field. This time, leave the default value blank, but select the Auto Insert option. This way, if an item is identified as hazardous, the hazardous value will be sent from the item to the order entry detail line. If the item is not hazardous, the optional field value will be blank. If you placed a hazardous value in the default value field, the value entered here will override the value coming from inventory control, and it will always appear even for items that are not hazardous. Let's return to order entry and create our order again for Ronald Black. Selecting the fluorescent desk lamp, and then choosing to display the optional fields. This time, the optional field value that was saved with the item, asbestos in this case, is there. It can be changed to a different value if necessary, however, not in this case. Depending on the optional field settings that were discussed earlier, it may or may not be possible to remove the optional field, enter free-form text, or accept a blank code. Remember, optional field values can only be transferred to field types that are related. It is not possible to transfer an item optional field directly to an accounts receivable customer optional field because those fields are not indexed and do not communicate with one another. It is possible, though, to transfer the hazardous optional field to an accounts receivable invoice detail optional field because order entry detail lines eventually generate an accounts receivable invoice detail line. It's even possible to pass optional field information back to the general ledger for unique reporting requirements, assuming the field types relate. Let's continue with this example and transfer the optional field further. To accomplish this, repeat the steps discussed above to incorporate the accounting functions for the optional field to pass. In order entry, a sales order generates a shipment which then generates an invoice. At this point, the hazardous optional field has only been identified with items entered within the order entry icon, not within the shipment or invoice icons. Therefore, if a shipment or invoice is generated from the previously entered sales order containing the hazardous optional field, the link will be severed and no hazardous optional field information will transfer. To have the hazardous optional field transfer to other areas of Accpac, it needs to be instructed to transfer to both shipments and invoices by selecting the appropriate accounting function within the optional fields icon. In this case, both the shipment detail and the invoice detail accounting functions. As before, instruct the system to leave the default value blank, but have the system perform an auto insert. Notice when selecting shipment details or invoice details that the setting button becomes available. This is because the function generates general ledger accounting transactions. Because the purpose is to pass the hazardous optional field information to accounts receivable and eventually general ledger, click the setting button and identify which accounting types the optional field is to be passed. Very rarely will more than one or two of these fields need to be checked. There's no need to store unnecessary optional field information for an accounting function if it isn't required. The default setting for all accounting functions is toggled on, so deselect the ones that are not required. For the purpose of this example, let's pass the optional field information to the sales revenue account. Notice that the sales revenue account first goes to the accounts receivable module. Therefore, the hazardous optional field needs to be identified within the accounts receivable invoice details function to have it eventually transfer to general ledger. Otherwise, the optional field value will have no place to go and will terminate. In addition, in order for the general ledger account to receive the optional field, the hazardous optional field will need to be assigned to the general ledger account that will be used when the transaction gets posted. Let's first assign the optional field to accounts receivable. Like before, select the optional fields icon, this time from AR Setup, and add the hazardous optional field to the invoice details section. This is because order entry details generate accounts receivable invoice detail lines. Again, indicate to set a value, but leave the default blank. Selecting the Settings button, verify or select the sales revenue account, so the optional field value will transfer to the account assigned for the item being purchased. Obviously, multiple sales revenue accounts can be defined in Accpac. So determine which accounts receive optional field values and which ones don't. For this example, let's say you want the hazardous optional field to be transferred to the general ledger sales revenue account identified with the accessories category A1. The sales revenue account assigned to category A1 is 4010-110. Before the hazardous optional field can be linked to this account, assign the optional field to account transactions in general. As before, select the optional fields icon, this time from within general ledger, and link the hazardous optional field, leaving a blank default value. Next, select the accounts icon and access account 4010-110. There are two optional field tabs, one for the account master and one for the transactions posted to the account. Select the Transaction Optional Fields tab and add the hazardous optional field using a blank default value. Let's return to order entry and post the sales order for the fluorescent desk lamps, and at the same time indicate to generate a shipment and invoice. Order entry generates the next sequential order, shipment, and invoice number. Let's continue with this example to the next phase and pass the hazardous optional field to the accounts receivable invoice detail. Because the order entry integration automatically created an accounts receivable invoice batch when the invoice in order entry was posted, the invoice transaction in accounts receivable can be observed. Select the invoice batch, and subsequently the journal entry within the invoice batch. Highlight the sales revenue account and proceed to the optional fields column within the details section. The hazardous optional field for the sales revenue account shows the text asbestos. Exit the batch. When the invoice batch is posted within accounts receivable, the invoice transaction will be transferred to General Ledger containing the hazardous optional field value of asbestos for the sales revenue account. With the accounts receivable batch now posted, let's observe the general journal entry that was created in General Ledger. Select the General Ledger batch list window, recall the batch, that accounts receivable just posted, and observe the journal entry that the invoice created. Selecting the optional field column for the sales revenue account, the optional field value of asbestos can be seen. Once the batch is posted in General Ledger, the optional field value will be permanently assigned to the General Ledger transaction. You can then inquire on or print a series of reports, including financial statements, based on optional field values. We realize that the above procedure may appear complicated. However, it is just a matter of setting the system up properly. Once the optional field settings have been established throughout all the modules, the optional fields will flow between the modules automatically, unknown to any user. The Optional Fields Course Reference Guide includes a series of flowcharts that fully explain the flow of optional field values between accounting functions and applications.
You have successfully completed this topic and learned how to set up and configure the Transaction Analysis and Optional Field Creator module, set up and assign optional fields, and transfer field values from one module to another. For homework, please review the Optional Fields Course Reference Guide and complete the Optional Fields case study. For review, you can complete the exam crayons, which are launched from your profile at Sage Software University.